Hi, my name is Mike Croissant. I'm the author of Bombing Hitler's Hometown and a retired CI officer, and I live in Texas. This story begins as a family mystery. My uncle Ellsworth Croissant was a first lieutenant in the Army Air Forces in World War II. He flew 21 combat missions with the 459th Bomb Group, which was part of the 15th Air Force, which flew out of Italy. He survived the war without a scratch, but was killed in a plane crash in Wisconsin when he got a chance to take a brief leave for the weekend. My family was never given a satisfactory explanation from the Army. So in about 2007, I launched my own investigation, if you can call it that, to determine why he was taken from us. To make a long story short, this launched me down a path to learn as much as I could about my uncle, and that led me to this story. I had very little to begin with, including this obviously poor reproduction of his crew photo, which I discovered in about 2010. But over the course of the next couple of years, I obtained more and more information about him. I identified the other members of his crew, and I successfully made contact with his navigator, Bill Johnson, and we became good friends. As time passed, I was given the letters that my uncle wrote from the war. The letters he wrote home. My aunts were in possession of those, and they shared those with me. I used those to piece together the combat missions that he went on. And for each mission, I would examine the target and why the Air Force bombed it that particular day. Well, far down on the list of his missions, I came to the one on Linz, Austria, which happened on April 25th, 1945. This was right at the very end of the war, and as it turned out, was the last mass bomber raid of the war in Europe. Linz, as you see here, is located smack in the center of Europe. It's the third largest by population city in Austria then and today. And the 15th Air Force was based out of the boot of Italy. It was about an 8-hour mission from them, which was not the maximum capability they could reach, but it was still a significant mission nonetheless. What I didn't know when I started this process was that Linz was also the town that Adolf Hitler considered home. The Hitlers moved around a lot in his youth, and at age 9, the family settled in a suburb of Linz, and for the next 9 years or so, they would live in or near the city of Linz. And some significant things happened to young Adolf at this time. He went through puberty, which is not easy for anyone. He lost both of his parents. He lost his baby brother. And significantly, he was exposed to German nationalist ideas for the first time. This photo is from 1900. Adolf was 11 years old, and this is the middle school where he was introduced to what would later become German nationalist ideas. Now, Hitler drops out of school in high school, right around age 16, I believe, and he spends his days strolling through the streets of Linz. He kept a sketchbook where he would write poetry and draw. He loved Linz, but he hated many aspects of it. He thought they were ugly. So he would daydream and he would sketch what he would do were he in a position to do so, to change Linz. Well, we all know what happens next. He goes off to Vienna and becomes a field art student. He is in World War I, and then following that, he becomes introduced to the Nazi Party and then later becomes the head of it. So fast forwarding to March 1938, Hitler is now the leader of Nazi Germany, and he enters Austria at the head of a conquering army. This is an extraordinary photo from that day. His convoy makes a beeline for Linz as soon as he stops and pays respects at the graves of his parents. When they arrive, there is a huge crowd. According to eyewitnesses, the crowd is larger than the population of the city. He takes this balcony at the town square and gives a rousing speech. The crowd goes absolutely wild. And the response is so great that, according to eyewitnesses and several historians, Hitler decided then and there to go ahead and annex Austria. So yesterday's daydreamer is now in a position to do something about those adolescent dreams. He wants to remake Linz as the cultural capital of Europe. He would see his parents reburied there. He would be buried next to them. He would retire there, and he would also have the city reconstructed in his own image. Among other things, there would be a massive art museum, which would house the greatest works of art in Europe. And these would soon be stolen from across the continent by his minions. All of that would go into Linz. Now, the problem was he had no way to pay for that. So Hitler embarks on an industrialization of Linz in order to raise tax revenues to pay for these things. As a result, the entire eastern part of the city is turned into the Hermann Göring works. Initially, they produced steel here and other things, and then as the war begins and goes against the Germans, they begin building armaments. The rail system in Linz, which was already quite formidable, is also expanded, and all of these things taken together make Linz a military target. So on July 25th, 1944, Linz becomes a target of the 15th Air Force and the first of 21 raids. This photo is taken from that day. You can see the Danube River snaking through the city, and you can see smoke billowing from the Göring works. I did interview a man from one of these bombers. He went up, obviously, with 10 fingers. He came back with 8, thanks to a German fighter that shot up his aircraft. We're going to fast forward now, again, to March and April 1945. The tide has long since turned against the Germans. Soviet armies are approaching from the east, and American, British, and other armies are approaching from the west. Linz is in the crosshairs of both the Soviets and Patton's Third Army. Unfortunately for our boys on the aircraft that day, Vienna falls to the Soviets on April 12th and 13th, 1945. But before it can do so, the Germans are able to withdraw many of the anti-aircraft guns that were once protecting the former capital of Austria, and they placed those guns in Linz. Linz had always been very well defended due to the rail junction and the Göring works, but now it's even more so. And on April 20th, photographic reconnaissance flights indicate that Linz now is home to 164 anti-aircraft guns, and its rail system is full of about 2,000 rail cars full of presumed supplies to extend the war effort. Now, at this time, it was feared that the Germans would withdraw to the so-called National Redoubt and conduct a guerrilla war against the Allies. And the fear, according to the intelligence reports from that day, was that the supplies would end up there and thus extend the war. That turned out to not be so, but they didn't know it at the time. So the boys have a very tough day. This is unfortunately not a photo of the anti-aircraft barrage from that day. I could not locate one. This is an earlier barrage that happened over Vienna. Each black puff of smoke is the detonation of an 88 millimeter artillery shell. Each detonation would send hot shrapnel, thousands of pieces of it in all directions. The idea was to strike as many bombers as possible, damage them, and set them off course, and therefore reduce the accuracy of the bombing. Now, in studying this mission, I came across the accounts of several veterans on the internet, and almost to a man, they would describe how brutal the anti-aircraft barrage was that day. Chief among them was this man, John Dominy. His nickname was Duck because he could perfectly imitate Donald Duck. He did so with me on the telephone. Duck shouldn't have even been on the mission. He injured his shoulder the night before taking a shower, but he wanted to go on the mission because he knew the war was almost over. He hoped the war was almost over, and he didn't want to let his buddies down. They were very close as a crew, so he goes on the mission. And John is the ball turret gunner, meaning he mans the spherical gun turret underneath the B-24. It has two 50 caliber machine guns, and he is rotating the turret, scanning for German fighters, when the nose gunner calls out flak 12 o'clock level. To us civilians, that means straight ahead of our aircraft is a German flak barrage. He rotates his turret to face the front, and what he sees chills him to the core. And he writes, "I knew that I was going to die. The flak was like a solid black wall." John thinks he has a mere few minutes left to live, so he begins to say the Lord's Prayer. And he knows he doesn't have time to finish it. So he pauses and he asks God, "Will you have me?" The response he gets back is one that fills him with peace. And within a matter of moments, his plane enters the flak field. This is an extraordinary photo from that day. 4 minutes into the Battle of Linz, the first aircraft is hit. This is Judith Ann. It's a B-24 Liberator with the 459th Bomb Group. An 88 millimeter shell has passed through the nose and detonated above the aircraft, damaging 2 engines and wounding a person in the nose of the bomber. The aircraft cannot stay airborne, and the men direct it to the outskirts of Vienna, where they bail out, and they would soon be taken in by occupying Soviet forces. One after another, the bombers would be struck by flak. This is a photo that does not appear in my book for copyright reasons, but it is indeed extraordinary. The bomber in the air here is with the 465th Bomb Group. I interviewed 2 men on this aircraft. They were told at the morning briefing before the mission that if they can make it to Hungary, go to this area called Pech. That's the city, Pech. You can see at the bottom of the screen an airfield of sorts. They locate the airfield and make a quite messy crash landing, but all the men make it. If you look very closely, you see a second bomber. This is with the 460th Bomb Group under the command of Vahan Mardarian. Lieutenant Mardarian does not spot the airfield, and he crashes in a rather terrible way. The bomber collides with an anti-tank ditch, which rips out the entire nose of the bomber. And when the aircraft finally comes to a stop, Lieutenant Mardarian looks down and sees dirt below his rudder pedals. Both crews survive. They are banged up, but they survive. And they are taken in by the Soviets. Now, by the terms of previous treaties, the Soviets are obligated to take in our men and to see to their needs and ultimately to evacuate them. And that happens through the port of Odessa in the Soviet Ukraine. And in the process of getting the men out, they get into a lot of what I would call misadventures. The Soviets do some rather comical things with them. It's all in the book. But overall, they treat them pretty well. But there is one exception. This is Dale Shabilsky. He is a young 20-year-old lad from Omaha, Nebraska. He is of Polish extraction. Dale is on his 33rd combat mission today. He only has to do 2 more and he can go home. He is the radio operator on his B-24. The Liberator is struck badly over Linz. Dale is wounded in 2 places. It's not severe, but he is bleeding profusely. The tail gunner is hit as well. The bomber attempts to make it to the airfield at Pech. They can't stay airworthy long enough to make it, so they effect a crash landing in a farmer's field in Hungary. Friendly Hungarians rush the aircraft. They spirit away the uninjured members of the crew. They take the injured tail gunner in a second direction, and they take Dale in a third. They give him medical treatment. Though they don't share a common language, they find ways to communicate. They prevail on him to shed his American uniform and his identity papers, which is, as we will soon see, a mistake. He keeps only his dog tags and his .45 caliber pistol. The men walk to Budapest, and in Budapest they come across a Soviet patrol. Dale gives himself over to the Soviets, identifies himself in Russian as an American, and hopes to be treated well. Well, unfortunately, he has no identity kit papers. He's not in uniform, and the Soviets accuse him of being a German spy. And in some of the most horrific scenes in the book, for days and days, they detain and torture him before finally agreeing to release him to the Americans. Ultimately, 15 bombers would go down this day. I will not go through each one. This is another extraordinary photo that I could not use in the book. You're looking at the remnants of the tail section of a B-17 bomber called Old Folks with the 99th Bomb Group. I interviewed the man who was sitting in the rear of that aircraft, Boyd Rice from Lubbock, Texas. He was the tail gunner. He is wounded by flak in the ribs over Linz. The aircraft is devastated. The men bail out. The pilot, who is severely wounded, crawls to the bomb bay, and with about 200 feet to spare, he manages to bail out and deploy his parachute. All of the men are captured by the Germans and spend the rest of the war in German captivity. Now, I obtained this photo early in my research, but I made 2 research trips to Linz. The second one was in 2019. And on that trip, I'm sitting one day in a museum in rural Austria, a tiny little town, and I come across this photo. And the curator sees me admiring the photo, and he says, "I know where that is." So he tells us what town, and my Austrian interpreter and driver look at each other and silently agree that we would go out there. So we hop in a car, we come to this village, we stop, and my interpreter starts talking to this Austrian man that we spotted randomly by the roadside. Show him the photo. He says, "Yes, I know exactly where that is." He hops in the car, and we go. Well, what do you know? The home, the structure in the background there, which I was told was a school back in 1945, is still there. In the bottom photo, in the foreground, is an Austrian's home. They invited us in, and I found this picture from World War II in a frame by their front door. We had a wonderful conversation, and the man who led us there said, "I know a man who was there when this happened. Would you like to meet him?" Of course, the answer was yes. So he goes off and comes back a few minutes later with this man, Franz Kropik, who at the time was 11 years old. And he described to us the destruction of the bomber over his village. He didn't have school that day, and he was the second one on scene. Well, just down the hill from this house, there is one remnant of the bomber, and that's a tire from the main landing gear. It's now in the backyard of one of the homes there. And I borrowed a pocket knife and cut a piece away for a souvenir. The last of 15 bombers to go down will also be the last one I speak of today. It was a B-17 under the command of Robert Sinton. This man is Herbie Westerland. He was the navigator that day. I did speak to him just before he passed away. Herbie and his crew had a very rough day. Their bomber was devastated, and they all bailed out except for the co-pilot, who was deceased aboard the aircraft. Every one of them is shot at as they descend in their parachutes. One man is struck with a bullet under his chin. The bullet exits through the top of his head. He is deceased. Third man, his parachute is damaged over the target, and it does not properly deploy when he jumps, and he falls to his death. The other men survive, and unfortunately they land in or near Mauthausen, which of course is the most notorious concentration camp in Austria. These are photos from my visit in 2019. In small groups, they are taken inside and placed in front of what was known as the Wall of Lamentations. All new inductees, if you will, to the camp are taken here and introduced to their new life. The men are lined up, initially the first 3, including Herbie, and are abused by the deputy camp commandant. He spits upon them, slaps them, and verbally abuses them for probably a few hours, near as I can tell. Throughout the day, other men are brought in, as well as the bodies of two of the deceased. Those men are cremated in the ovens and presumably rest here. This massive mound in the center of this photo is called the Ash Cemetery. It's a mound of human ash. And those 2 Americans now rest for eternity amongst the ashes of the tens of thousands of victims of Nazi extermination. Despite all the fear and the blood and the screaming and the tribulation and the courage, the mission is a wild success. The target is absolutely annihilated, and Linz is left defenseless. On May 5th, elements of Patton's Third Army enter the city, and this is a photo of what remains of the rail system. Linz would be under American control during the post-war occupation. The area just to the north of the Danube River is the Soviet zone. And because we, the Americans, controlled Linz, we poured a lot of money into restoring it. A lot of money from the Marshall Plan goes into Linz. We rebuild the Goering Works under a new name, of course. It's just off the frame to the left here. The rail system has been rebuilt. And I took this photo in 2012 on the rail pass that one of my uncle's bombs hit and destroyed that day. And I determined that from a photo and a post-mission observation. So that was quite fulfilling. Now for the men who made it through the mission, that was the vast majority, fortunately. They all carried scars. Every man I talked to that as far as I could determine, carried with him PTSD in some form. I haven't spoken yet of this man, Hal Millett. He was a young man. He turned 19 over Vienna on a date in which he was almost killed. Hal was a genius with an IQ of 160, and he was also an atheist. And his approach to getting through the war at his position in the ball turret was to reason his way through the war and to think of solutions to any bad scenario that could happen to him. Well, this is obviously a very bleak outlook on life, and it affected him. He did suffer from PTSD, and in the early days of the internet, his daughter approached him after she came across a posting by his pilot. She encouraged him to reconnect with his crew. Hal had taken all of his memories, and he was a computer guy, so he described it to me as taking his memories from the war and putting them on part of the hard drive that could not easily be accessed. So he has gone so far as to forget the names of most of his crew members. Well, with his daughter's loving intervention, he opens himself to the possibility of opening those memories again. And he does so. In 2002, the surviving members get together. They pore over maps and photos, and it all comes back to Hal. And after this multiple-day reunion ends and he returns to his home in Florida, he has a breakdown. I caught Hal, and all of these men for that matter, in a sweet spot of their lives in which they're finally ready to begin unburdening themselves and to talk more widely. I would later interview another 50-plus survivors of the mission. Hal, as I said, was an atheist. Unfortunately, I don't know that changed before he died, but I did manage to talk to him in his last days on Earth. And I could tell, I called him in the hospital, and I could tell he was regaling the nurses with tales from the war. And it was really good to see that my friend had seemingly found peace. Dale Shabilsky, the man who was tortured by the Soviets, almost goes without saying that he suffered from PTSD. He had nightmares for most of his life. But like Hal, he had a loving daughter who prevailed upon him to start talking about things. He wrote a memoir that I was given access to. I did speak with him on the phone. And he began speaking about it in public, his war experiences. But between talking about it and his Christian faith, I believe that Dale also found peace near the end of his life. And finally, Duck Dominy, I spoke of him near the beginning. Duck's crew was shot down. They, all but one of them, were captured by the Germans and spent the rest of the war as prisoners of war of the Germans. Duck, as a ball turret gunner, had a very uncomfortable time in the war because it was such a cramped position. He came home after his experience as a prisoner. He had a brother who was 10 years younger than him, and one day he was taking his brother to play when a car backfired, and before Duck knew it, he was taking shelter under the front porch. And to his shame, he emerged to find his baby brother playing alone in the street. Duck did talk about the war somewhat through his twilight, also was a deep Christian, so I believe he too found peace. Unfortunately, the mission over Linz was the last one for 24 young Americans. These are their name, ranks, and units. Their stories are in my book, The book is also the story of the last minutes on Earth of a 25th man, that being my uncle Ellsworth. He, as I noted, died in a plane crash just after the war ended. I visited his grave in 2012, and I pledged to him that I would tell his story. That was a somewhat of a foolish pledge to make, because at that point I knew very little about him. I didn't have his letters. I didn't have many photos of him. I knew enough to write maybe 10 pages. But through the course of more than 10 years and connecting with many, many more veterans and doing first-person research, finding first-person sources, a lot of archival research, 2 visits to Linz, visits to a couple of other pertinent countries, I was able to tell this story, the story of the last mass bomber raid of World War II in Europe. Happy to say that in this past April 2024, after the book came out, I revisited my uncle's grave and left a copy there for him. I kept my promise. My mission was accomplished, and we had a very emotional moment together. That, my friends, is the story of bombing Hitler's hometown. There's much more detail in the book, of course. The story is an action-adventure, but it is heavy. It's not something you probably want to read before bed. One of the best compliments I got from the veterans who were able to read a version of the manuscript before they passed is that I came as close to getting it right as it is possible for one to be, having not been there. I try to put the reader in those bombers, and through interviews of Austrians on the ground, I try to give you a sense of what it was like for them as well. The QR code here will take you to my website, which has a lot of stories that I necessarily had to cut from the book. It has a lot more photographs. It has a video trailer I did for the book and many other things. So I hope you will go there and check it out. And I appreciate you listening, and I would be grateful to answer any questions.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. It was a fantastic presentation. Very interesting. I actually uh, really did enjoy your book, and I'm going to quote you something from it just to show you that I did read it. We have a bunch of questions too, so that'll be good. Um, and you write here, as the day fast approaches, when there will be no more veterans left to relate their tales, remembering their valor now falls to we who inherited their legacy of perseverance, optimism, selflessness, and courage. And you add that we should never forget all that they did for us. So, my first question to you is, do you think that they, day in, day out, as bomber crews, felt optimistic, selfless, and were aware of the extent of courage they would need to finish out the war? I mean, what was it day to day like being in a bomber crew when you knew that you could be killed at any second?
The men, I think, the men were all proud to serve. While it was happening, though, I think uh, the sense I got from many was that they resented having to do it. Not in terms of resented having to serve their country. They were ready for that to a man. By the way, not a single man I spoke with waited to be drafted. They all volunteered, some at age 17. They resented the fact that their teenage years were disrupted by the war and that they had to put on the uniform and go off to stop this madman. But in retrospect, they were all extremely proud of their service, and rightly so. The day-to-day life, the at this point in the war, the men had to, the airmen, the combat airmen had to finish 35 missions, and then they could go home. The ground crews were there for the duration, but the air crews had to go 35 times. I spoke with men who were on their first mission that day and men who were on their last mission that day. One name you probably recognize who was on his last mission that day was George McGovern. He was there. His account is in the book. The men were rested from bed before dawn to attend a morning briefing where they were told what the target would be and what they would expect. Then they would go out to the aircraft and begin putting on many layers of clothing. These aircraft were unpressurized and unheated. So, and just to survive and fight 5 miles above the earth, they had to have an electric suit that would plug into an outlet and produce heat throughout their body. They had to be on oxygen. You can't breathe 5 miles above the earth without help. So before they even met the enemy, their lives were in peril. If any of these things failed, they would have problems. So we're talking hours of being cold and on oxygen. The discharge from their breath could freeze in the oxygen mask and cause them to lose consciousness. Any number of things could go wrong before even meeting the enemy in battle. So it was hours of misery, especially in the ball turret. And then there would be a brief moment of battle. At this point in the war, the German Air Force was not a factor. A couple of fighters did appear over or near the target this day, but there was only one exchange of fire with a fighter that I came across. But otherwise, the Luftwaffe was not a factor. It was only the flak that the men had to face, and it was completely indiscriminate. The Germans shot up a picture in your minds a cubicle, a cube of exploding flak, 2,000 feet wide, 2,000 feet high, and 2,000 feet deep. And the men had to fly directly into it. The Germans plotted where the bombs would be released, and they filled that part of the sky with exploding shrapnel, with the hope that they would damage enough bombers to lessen the damage on the target. The bomb run was, I believe, 6 minutes this day. So 6 minutes of sheer terror, especially today with the obscene amount of anti-aircraft fire. And most men made it, but some did not, unfortunately. And everyone that I talked to that survived it were never the same again.
I want to talk more broadly before we go to some specific questions. You are no doubt aware of the long-standing debate about whether Allied strategic bombing was very effective. Most historians agree that are sensible that it was effective, but to what extent did it really make a critical difference in terms of determining victory in Europe in World War II?
Oh, that's far above my pay grade. But
Well, sorry, it's going
but
to be at your pay grade right now. So just give me
as
your
I
views, because this is an interesting debate that a lot of our listeners and viewers, who know something about the air war, this is worth talking about, I think.
it's something we'll be debating for another 80 years and then some, I'm sure. I'll just comment based on this mission. The previous missions to take out the rail system and the Goering Works at Linz were completely ineffective. Badly misguided bombs, misdrops rather. It was only at the very end that we finally hit the target very extensively. I don't know why it was that that it was like that day, but whatever was in those rail cars, those 2,000 rail cars, did not end up in the hands of people who could hurt our boys further and extend the war. I'm on the I come down on the side of Donald Miller, who wrote in Masters of the Air that the I believe this was his argument that the effort to strike, I believe it was coal, is what really ultimately affected the German war effort. I could be wrong on that. It's been a few years, but that's my answer.
Yeah, well, I think certainly in terms of destroying Germany's supply of oil, it was a fantastic success, strategic Allied
Hmm.
bombing. That's the one example that many people cite as being essential. Albert Speer agreed that it was very effective. Donitz said that the war in the Atlantic was significantly impacted by Allied bombing. So we have 160,000 Allied airmen killed in World War II in the European theatre. 160,000 Allied airmen killed in the European theatre in World War II. 33,700 planes lost. These are giant numbers. But the impact was significant. I'll come on to some questions later. And I think that many people don't realize the extent of the destruction. Hamburg, 75% of built up areas, 75% of Hamburg destroyed. A city that many people haven't heard of, Bochum, 83% of that city destroyed. On average, major industrial centers, it's around about 50%. What did the men, this is from Colin, what did the men do after the war? Are there were any of the characters that you write about that had particularly interesting post-war careers?
Excuse me, there were two people, and I've already mentioned one, George McGovern, ran for president in 1972. Norman Lear, the
Oh yeah,
TV producer who just passed a few months ago, was on the mission. He's in the book.
wow.
Um,
I've actually met Norman Lear.
oh
I
yeah,
met him about 25 years ago. Yeah, but only for about
yeah,
5 minutes. But anyway, carry on.
yeah. And then the men I spoke to about 55 in their twilight years, and they were all very successful in life. You know, some battled with demons. Many did, in fact, and uh, in some cases, the demons presented themselves in alcohol or other things, but ultimately got through it. Um, and they were school teachers, Boy Scout leaders, farmers. Quite a few were architects. I don't know if there's a connection there, wanting to design and build things after having destroyed things. Maybe was part of the mentality, but the men were all, as far as I know, very successful and lived full lives.
This is from Clara. Uh, did you ever find out the circumstances and details of your uncle's death?
I did. The Army Air Forces filed a report, and this I didn't speak at it in detail in the presentation, but my uncle boarded a C-45 transport in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with the intention of going home for a few days. This was in September 1945, so the war has been over for about a month. And the plane, there are six passengers and one pilot. They're flying in bad weather, and the plane crashes near Madison, Wisconsin. I bought the Army Air Force's investigation report and pieced together what I thought happened because my family was never really told an answer that satisfied them. The answer they got was that the plane ran out of gas in bad weather and crashed, and that's not what happened. The needle and ball instrument, also known as the turn and bank indicator, was faulty on the aircraft. The pilot was flying alone. He didn't have a co-pilot. And in the course of a matter of minutes, the aircraft essentially fell out of the sky. I do not know exactly why, but it's possible the pilot became disoriented in the storm. The aircraft impacted on a farm, and when it struck a fence, it came apart, and all of the men were killed. And I didn't mention this in the book, but I did connect with a local man in that area who knew the history of the farms and who owned them. I gave him enough information that he was able to determine where the crash happened, and I visited it. We go back to your introduction where you said I practice full contact history, and that's one example. I like to get out and visit these sites and get my hands dirty, and that was a pretty profound moment to see where that fence was that killed my uncle. And I do have photos of the crash as well, the what remains of the aircraft. But a dark time for the family. Of course, there were eight of them. Particularly my father. They were only 13 months apart in the birth order. They were very close, and it destroyed my father. And the getting the report, though, the report that I made about what happened, I think gave people a measure of closure, and for that I'm grateful.
Was your father still alive when you started researching the book?
He was. My father was in World War II as well. He stayed domestically. He was in the 21st Coast Artillery in Delaware. He he was still alive when I started the initial part of the research. He benefited from the answers I was able to give about the crash, but then he passed shortly after. So he did not know that I was going to write this book or study my uncle's life, unfortunately.
That's this is David Trail from Florida. Hi, David. Great to have you back with us again, yet again. What was the most profound moment you had while researching your book?
There were so many. I guess I would have to say visiting Mauthausen. Yeah, everyone needs to go to a concentration camp and see it and absorb what evil looks like. Yeah, I went, and in this case, I had, because it was a war crime, what was inflicted upon those men who were brought there. There was an extensive investigation. So I had extensive National Archives documentation about it, almost a minute by minute direct dialogue, what happened. So it was really intense to go that wall where the men were lined up, the wall of lamentations, and stand there and picture. At one point, the deputy commandant took one of our boys and slammed his head into that jagged stone wall and cut his head open, and to picture all of that happening, and the to visit the ovens where the men were cremated, and then especially the ash cemetery, this huge mound of human ash. It's hard to wrap your mind around it, and to be able to go there and see it and pay my respects not only to them but to the tens of thousands of other victims was a powerful moment.
So you've served your country in the CIA. Did writing this book change the way that you feel about being an American?
No, I've been a patriotic American my whole life. I grew up as a child of the Cold War to not only a father but many other relatives who served in World War II and other wars. I've always treasured the rights I have as an American. I tried to follow my uncle into the Air Force, but in the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at the University of Illinois, my second year, I developed drug-resistant bronchitis for 10 months, and I never recovered physically enough to put my career back on track. So I took off the uniform before getting a commission, and I still wanted to serve. And I knew I was from a young age, very interested in international affairs, and I could write decently. So, long story short, I became a CIA analyst in 1999. Was there on 9/11, and in the years that followed, my career was often interwoven with the so-called war on terrorism. I served in several places overseas, and loved it. Love serving, love the people. They're the best people in the world, and was very glad I did it. So no, the book didn't change my thoughts on being an American, but it gave me an even deeper appreciation for the men of that generation. I mean, these men asked nothing in return. They went off at age 18, 19, 20, saved the world, and then came back and asked almost nothing. And that's incredible. So God bless them all.
I think we would all agree, and thank you for your service. Was there any point at which you ran into a research obstacle that was really difficult? Was there anything that you couldn't crack? Anything that really frustrated you?
There was one thing. There was a number of war crimes perpetrated against our men that day. There was an outbreak of violence committed by Austrians against American airmen in the late stages of the war. One of them, the man's name was Joachim Perfrater. I'm probably murdering the name. Not Perfrater, I'm sorry. Uh, anyway, this man was on convalescent leave. He was a notorious Nazi and came out from where he was taking shelter during the raid and with a submachine gun shot at an American parachuting to the earth over Linz. Um, the American was killed, and he was charged. But the trail ran cold in the National Archives. I found references to this man and that he was sentenced, but I do not know what happened to him. I didn't find the full report, so there was a lot more happening there that I could have talked about, but wasn't able to find the evidence. So that was unfortunate. But overall, I went to great pains. This thing took me 14 years to get done. And I had a lot going on in my life at that time, serving and having small children. I made many trips to the National Archives, interviewed many men. Whenever I could meet them in person, I would drive and do so out of respect. So the time I spent was long, but it was well worth it. I wouldn't change a thing. And these men made my life richer having known them.
What was the most satisfying aspect of seeing the book published? Was it basically, oh, it's done at last? I've got this thing out the door. What was great about having it published? Because I know it was just earlier this year, wasn't it?
There was a great amount of relief. I started the research in 2011, and I was doing internet research from a far, far off country, like one of the most remote countries in the world. Uh, and it was cold. It was the middle of winter. In this little hotel I was in, started the ball rolling, and it as it the snowball rolled down the hill, it just got bigger and bigger. But to finally hold the book and flip through it and to see my words, and then later to hear the audiobook and hear my words read back to me was incredible. It was a great sense of relief. And my one regret is that I was not fast enough to share it with any of the men. I think three men read a version of the manuscript and gave me very good feedback. But the last man that I was in touch with, Richard Halliday, who almost died over Linz from anoxia after he was wounded and his oxygen system was pierced. He almost made it to the finish line. I called him when I got the book deal, and he processed the information. He called me back and he thanked me, and he said, "Now our children will know what we did." That was profound, and made me feel really good. And I just wish that he had lived to see the final product. But all things happen for a reason, and now at least the children and grandchildren will know, and I can live with that.
Apart from telling the story to the children and the grandchildren and the great great grandchildren, etc., what would you say to a class of high school students that is most important to remember about the service of your uncle and others during World War II? What lessons do you want young people today to take away from your work, your book, and our study of World War II?
Oh, another $64,000 question. I would
Uh,
say that every generation faces a great test. And theirs was literally to save the world. You had um, two evil empires. You had a Soviet empire as well that would later replace, to a large extent, one of those two that fell. The men, the boys, really were called upon to put a stop to that. Uh, like I said earlier, they set their childhoods aside and set their educations aside and for not a lot of money, they put on the uniform and went off to faraway places to fight and sometimes die. That's a very special thing. They did it with great pride. And like I said, they came back and asked nothing in return. They were completely selfless. And the moniker that's often applied to this generation, the greatest generation, I think, is quite worthy, quite good for them.
It would be nice to think that all Americans today, and certainly young Americans, would give at least something back to their country, given how much that generation gave us and how much they sacrificed. I just want to say, Mike, thanks for joining us. Awesome book. Where can people buy it right now? If they go online, Amazon, etc.
It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's in some bookstores. You have Kindle version, hardback, audio. Audio is good if you can't fall asleep at night because the narrator will certainly help with that. But the book itself is written as sort of an action adventure. It's pretty heavy. It's not something you want to pick up before bed. But I told it as if I was there witnessing the events, and according to the feedback I got from the men who read the manuscript, is that I came pretty close to describing what it was like. So that's the best praise I could receive. Please check it out. I can be reached with feedback on my website, mikecroissant.com.
Well, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. It's very generous of you. And I disagree with you fundamentally. It's a great bedtime read, and I slept extremely well last night because of it. But anyway, thank you.
Good.
We'd love you to come to DC, visit the memorial. Thank you, Mike, so much for taking this time this week.
Thank you. I appreciate it.